Okay, everybody, well, welcome to the first in the strand of education debates today at the Battle of Ideas. My name is Gareth Sturdy. I am one of the organisers of the Academy of Ideas Education Forum. And as I say, there's a strand of debates in this room today all about education. And none of the issues perhaps more hot topic than the subject that we're looking at this morning: are schools indoctrinating our kids? So this strand is partnered by the organisation Don't Divide Us, which campaigns for freedom, tolerance and a colourblind approach to anti-racism in education. And indeed, the director of Don't Divide Us is with us, Alka, Sehgal, Cuthbert. We'll hear from her shortly. But if you don't know about Don't Divide Us, do check them out. It's a really, really good organisation. So, indoctrination then. Can I just do a sort of straw poll in the room? Could you put up your hand if you think schools are indoctrinating our children? Thank you very much.
We can just go home then.
That's why I asked the question, because that will obviously determine the kind of debate we have here. Could you just put up your hand if you think that it's important that things like race, climate, gender, sex and relationships, those kind of things, those kind of issues should be in the curriculum? Do you think schools should be delivering material like that? Okay. Primary schools, secondary schools, doesn't matter. Okay, that's fine, thank you very much. Okay, well, the panel are no doubt going to raise this morning various aspects, some of the issues that I've just listed. So I'm not going to kind of give us a kind of list of examples here of the kind of things that perhaps some people consider are indoctrination. I will just say that in the last few days, as simply an example, in the last few days, the National Education Union looks like it's going to adopt proposals that suggest that debate about the trans issue in schools would itself be transphobic. To encourage a kind of debate about different viewpoints on that issue will be transphobic. So, I mean, that's just by way of saying that this issue of whether it's indoctrination or isn't is very, very live at the moment. But today in the debate, I'd like us to try and get into perhaps, where this has come from and what we do about it, more than just engaging in a kind of culture war about some of these issues. Well, to discuss that, I'm thrilled that we've got this panel this morning. I'm going to introduce them in the order in which I'm going to invite them to speak. And at the end of the table on my right, the first to speak will be Emma Webb. Emma is director of the Common Sense Society UK branch, which has a stand downstairs, I believe. So if you want to know more about that, then do check out that stand downstairs. Emma's also the host of Newspeak, which is the New Culture Forum's weekly current affairs show, and the New Culture Forum has done a very interesting film on the idea of indoctrination in schools that's just come out, so I recommend that. You can find that on YouTube. Emma's also co-founder of Save Our Statues, and she writes for titles including The Times, The Spectator, and regularly appears on the broadcast media. And then the next to speak will be Dr. Sean Lang, who's on my left. He is Senior Lecturer in History at Anglia, Ruskin University. He's the author of The First World War for Dummies, which I will be checking out after this debate. That sounds like just the book for me. And but also, what history do we need? An interesting question. And Sean is also a fellow of the Historical Association. So we're very pleased to have Sean with us today. And then the third speaker will be Dr. Deborah Hayton, to my immediate right. Deborah is a teacher of physics in Bristol. She's also a trade unionist and a columnist for the Spectator and Unherd, and writes a lot about education matters. So it's great to have Deborah here. Thank you very much for coming. And finally, our last speaker will be Dr. Alka, Sehgal, Cuthbert, whom I mentioned. the director of Don't Divide Us, a teacher, a member of the Ofsted Advisory Panel on English, and also a prolific author in education, including the title What Should Schools Teach? Disciplines, Subjects and the Pursuit of Truth, which was published by the Institute of Education. So they're our speakers for this morning. I think it's a fantastic panel. Can we just welcome our speakers? Thank you very much. So each speaker will speak for about 5 minutes. And then after that, we are going to go straight out to questions from you, because I think this debate will really be made by hearing from what you think, not just what the panel is thinking. So, if you're ready, Emma, we'll start with Emma. Off you go.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So I was saying to Gareth yesterday that in the process of preparing for this discussion, I did a sort of deep dive down the rabbit hole of examples of things and discovered that it really is just an endless pit of horrifying examples of what's going on in our schools. And Gareth mentioned Calvin Robinson's documentary that was produced by the New Culture Forum on this very subject, and I would urge everyone to go and give that a watch. When I was watching it, I was reminded of something that Kemi Badenoch said in Parliament not too long ago. She said that, and this is a quote, "What we are against is the teaching of contested political ideas as if they are accepted fact." So what I'm going to do briefly is run through some of these contested ideas, because obviously the crux of my view is, yes, schools are indoctrinating our kids, but it's also to do with the horrible implications that this has for teachers who dissent against what's going on. So the best way I can do this is by basically painting a series of vignettes on two subjects, race and gender. So I don't think for this audience there's any need for me to explain what CRT is. So I'm just going to take you through some examples of how that is manifesting itself in the curriculum. So the first newspaper story on this one, nursery teachers given non-statutory guidance telling them to teach white privilege. This was guidance put together by unions and charities through something called the Early Years Foundation. And teachers were being trained to teach anti-racism to toddlers, and that telling them that children's racial prejudice is at risk of, this is a quote, being maintained or reinforced unless teachers had specialist training to develop an understanding about white privilege, systemic racism, and how racism affects children and families in early years settings. And if we wanted to be cynical, we would say that this sounds like it's a bit of a gravy train, because obviously someone wants to provide that training. Another story, children who were around age 7 being told that they're not racially innocent. MPs said that Brighton and Hove City Council, who were behind this, were doing something akin to Soviet-style indoctrination. I agree with that. This programme was called Racial Literacy 101, and the sessions trained teachers to condemn, again a quote, the widespread view that young children are racially innocent. And it showed a diagram of acts that they said constituted covert white supremacy, and this included things like the denial of white privilege and Eurocentric curriculums. And the consultant apparently told the teachers, and this is a quote again, that science upholds the status quo. So without going into too much detail, you can see what the implications would be there for free speech if you're not allowed to even question the concept of white privilege, which is a contested political idea. There's also, in addition to that, the push to decolonise curriculums, which falls quite neatly into issues surrounding the teaching of history to our children, and the attempts to edit the reading lists by exam boards, as one headline put it, to take the curriculum from dead white men. So all of this is just straight out of the critical race theory playbook. And there's an extra layer of cruelty to all of this as well, because it doesn't necessarily chime with students' experiences, even if it might chime with excuses. We know from various studies, including by the government, that white working class boys are the most disadvantaged group in education. The statistics on this are enough to make you cry. Only 16% of free school meals eligible white British students started higher education at the age of 19 in 2018, which is the lowest compared to any other ethnic group except Irish and Roma traveller. And only 53% of these students met the expected standard of development at the end of the early years foundation stage. Yet, one of these courses were teaching students, training teachers, that pupils shouldn't be taught, quote, that race doesn't mean anything and that everyone can work hard to be successful. So this is bad for black students, because it's teaching them basically that they're victims and trapping them in a victim mindset, which is something that Kemi Badenoch has talked about at length, and also is bad for white students because it doesn't reflect their experiences. So quickly to run through some of the gender stories, Gareth already mentioned that Telegraph story this week, that transgender schools guidance says that discussing women's rights could be offensive. A draft policy by the National Education Union proposed changing the definition of transphobia so that it would include propagating concepts and misinformation harmful to trans people, which erase and ignore trans history, such as trans ideology and contagion, and discussing with a trans person how best to balance trans and sex-based women's rights, or refusing to acknowledge their identity, that their identities are real or valid. Primary school children being bullied for misgendering other students. Lucy Phillips from Safeguarding Schools Scotland said that they had stories of primary school children being vilified, being ostracised in the playground, being reprimanded, sent to the head teacher for sometimes accidentally misgendering, and reams of other stories, including from places like Eton, of young boys being told to put pillows underneath their T-shirts to simulate being pregnant, and being told in workshops to come out as straight, and told about toxic masculinity and porn and other things that were completely age inappropriate. So I just want to finish very, very briefly with a couple of examples of how this is actually affecting teachers as well as the students. So Joshua Sutcliffe, who was a Christian maths teacher, clearly a very sweet man who cared about his students, suspended for accidentally saying "well done, girls," to a class that had a trans child in it. He was investigated, and the punishment is the process in these cases. A reverend who was fired for giving a sermon, basically telling students that they didn't have to accept the things that they were being taught by activists who were coming into the school and teaching this ideology. And closer to home recently, an evangelical Christian teacher who was actually jailed when he returned to school after misgendering a student. So just to finish up, my point is that activists are using children as instruments for their ideological purposes, and good teachers are the collateral damage of this.
Okay, thank you very much, Emma. I mean, that gives us a really good introduction into the kind of issues that people are referring to when they say indoctrination. I suppose a question for us is, how much of this politicised teaching is a caricature? How much of it is widespread? Is this going on in all schools, or is it a few that get highlighted and then the situation looks a whole lot worse than it actually is? But anyway, let us move on to our second speaker then, which is Sean. Off you go.
Okay. Indoctrination is a powerful word, and it's an emotive word. And I think my worry with it is that it gives the impression that there's a sort of direction, that there's somewhere where it comes from, and that there's a sort of plan behind it. And I'm not sure that's the problem. I think the problem is something a bit different, although I'm simply talking in terms of what I see, and particularly in my sphere, which is history, the teaching of history, which, as Emma was saying, is one of the areas where you might very well see the sort of issue that we're talking about. To some extent, of course, schools are always indoctrinating. It's simply you use the term if it's something you disapprove of. There is an overt an agenda, if you like. So, obviously religious schools have it. The British values issue in both primaries and secondaries is another example, which certainly some people have called indoctrination, although I wouldn't. But it's first of all, where might it come from? Because we have a very decentralised system, and indeed it's become more so with the growth of academies. Who actually determines the curriculum? And indeed, that because of this, you can indeed get the sort of opening for activists that Emma was just describing. But it's not the DFE because the national curriculum doesn't apply to independent schools, it doesn't apply to academies. Exam boards, of course, have a greater hold on it, but a lot of it, particularly below the level of GCSEs, is in the hands of individual schools and therefore individual teachers. Superficially, if you look at the curriculum of your own local school, as I say, in my area of history, it will look rather different from what you might remember from your own school days. So, for example, you will find the teaching of African history in there. Medieval Mali, for example, is one that I've seen on a number of school curricula, or Benin, or Mughal India, or the Maya. And this will apply both at primary schools and at Key Stage 3, the lower years of secondary schools. Is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? I think it's a good thing. I've got no problem, never have had any problem with extending people's knowledge. I don't think there's any such thing as knowledge that you somehow shouldn't have. The trouble is that there's a price, simply because curriculum time is finite. So if you add more things in, then something has to give. And I don't think that has ever been identified. If you're going to pay that price, and it has to be paid, then you need to start thinking about the criteria for choice. And that is a debate I'm not seeing. Indeed, one of the things I do in the Historical Association is sit on its council. And I raised this very issue not a few months ago, because if you look on the Historical Association website, the first thing you'll see is diversity. Diversity is a major aim. It's been added to the association's sort of core aims. They do an annual survey of secondary school teachers. And in the last couple of years, diversity has been the number one issue that they've asked about, and it's sort of tabulated, and schools where it's not happening are encouraged to make it happen, and so on. So that's absolutely cool. So I said, well, I think we need to discuss what diversity means. And what the criteria are. There are certain areas which are obvious. It talks about women, about Black and Asian, LGBT, but where is it going to end? You can always add things in, and what is the cost? And that's the point, because there's a certain purpose behind the teaching of any subject in terms of shaping the society that we live in. And in the case of history, it has traditionally, for a long time, it was about a sort of political education. That's why history took off as a school subject. It was seen as a background to understanding the constitutional political system that we have. And indeed, recent politics has suggested that that sort of knowledge should be a priority, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding, including among politicians, about the sort of political system we actually have. It's not a presidential system, it's not a federal system, and so on. Yet that is what I would call the democratic deficit of this lack of criteria, which means that when you do look at what is taught in history, a sort of political humanities subject, what you find is this sort of emphasis on diversity, but not on what I would call a core of political historical knowledge. And this gets sort of caricatured as sort of dull, old-fashioned, and as you say, old dead white men. But actually, I'm sorry to say this, dead white men are what I do, and dead white men are what have created the political system that operates in this country. And if there's no debate, and what I wanted to see was a debate, and you can probably guess what I'm going to say, absolutely not, didn't want to debate it, it had been decided. So what I'm calling for is a facing of there is a problem, that there is a deficit, there's a price that we have paid in the interest of diversity. I think that price is in democracy and is in democratic understanding. And if we don't have a debate somewhere, then I think we're going to drift into a situation of ignorance, lack of understanding, and that obviously is what I'd like to see starting here.
Thank you very much, Sean. Perfect timing, by the way. 5 minutes on the dot. How about that? Thank you. You raise a number of interesting questions there. Indoctrination from one person isn't for another. Hasn't it always been like this to a certain extent? And also this idea of choice and democratic accountability in this. Very, very interesting questions. I hope we get into some of those issues when we discuss further. But for now, Debbie.
Thank you, Gareth. Well, of course schools are indoctrinating kids. It's like one of those irregular verbs, isn't it? I am offering guidance and advice to young people. You are persuading children to change their minds, and he's brainwashing them with his fanciful nonsense. We could debate why schools even exist, indeed, if it's not to change children, to mould them. And in the words of one former chair of the Commons Education Select Committee, perhaps to mould them into productive economic units. And after teaching for 26 years, I can quite believe that that's the government's plan. But I suspect many of us here are more concerned about the social and cultural dimensions. And I've got a specific view on some of the pressures faced by young people. I transitioned myself 10 years ago, but I've long since stopped believing that I ever changed sex. And I worry dreadfully about what children are being told today and the impact it's having on them and their mental health. But that's just one example in a much wider debate, as others have already intimated. And if transgender ideology disappeared tomorrow, something else would likely take its place. And we should therefore provide children, and more importantly, I think, their teachers, with the tools to recognise the indoctrination that often hides in plain sight. And there are tools to do this, or there were. I teach physics, as Gareth said, but back in 2010, I was asked to teach some A-level critical thinking. It was quite a shock for me and very different to teaching physics. And in that first year at least, I was happy if I was a full chapter in the textbook ahead of my class. But nobody taught me to think critically at school, but perhaps more significantly, nobody taught me to think critically in my first 14 years of teaching. Without the skills I acquired from teaching that course, I would have never held my own in the toxic and diverse and divisive transgender debate which is going on online at the moment. And in that debate and others, I may never have developed the ability to actually recognise indoctrination, and I would certainly have been left without the language to call it out. So what is critical thinking? It's not critical theory. Amongst other things, critical thinking equips students to critique arguments and assess the credibility of those making them. Always, I taught children, use 5 criteria if you're wanting to assess the credibility of a source. First, their reputation. Has somebody got a reputation to lose? Their ability to see the situation. Are they a good witness? Vested interests, important one. Do they have any expertise? Expertise. And their neutrality in the issue or bias. So reputation, ability to see, vested interests, expertise, neutrality, Raven, R-A-V-E-N. That's what I taught. And essentially, it helped my pupils answer the question, who told you that and why did you believe them? And it's a question I regularly ask others and to which I rarely get a coherent answer. So I say I taught critical thinking. I don't any longer. The government cancelled the A-level course in 2016. I wonder why. Maybe it was thought not necessary in order to form those productive economic units. But as I prepared for today's debate, I reflected on what today's children are losing out on. But the more I thought about it, the more I realised it's not children we should be worrying about. You know, children go to school and children are in the care of adults. The people we should be concerned about is their teachers. Teachers are getting no training on this at all. And it's teachers and adults who are responsible for what happens in schools, not children. And too many professionals have let too much go. And I'd say, going back to my Raven, groups with vested interests, perhaps with little in the way of reputation or expertise, have planted ideologies in our schools, and often from a very blinkered and biased perspective. In terms of Raven, their credibility is junk. It really is. But they'll never be stopped if they're never challenged. And if teachers don't have the language to challenge them, it will perpetuate. So I'd say that it's the teachers who have let things go that must also be challenged in these ways. And it's not rocket science to challenge them. Actually, it's quite fun. All we've got to do is ask that question. Who told you this? And why did you believe them? Thank you.
That's great. If we could just keep the applause till the end would be really great. But they clearly like what you said, Debbie. But I mean, you raise a really important issue about the responsibility of the student themselves here and the responsibility of their teachers. I mean, I was thinking just on the way in this morning that the students that threw soup over Van Gogh's sunflowers in the past few days, I mean, I suspect they thought they were thinking critically about the whole economic system and the use of fossil fuels. You may disagree, but I'm pretty sure they thought they were thinking critically. So it's a really interesting question. Hopefully we'll get into that. Our last speaker then, Alka.
Thank you. I want to change the question a bit, as my prerogative as a speaker. Rather than ask, are schools indoctrinating, which I think everybody kind of agrees on, I want to ask the question, which I think is prior, which is, are schools educating? Because I think if the schools are educating, then we can be fairly confident that they won't be indoctrinating, right? So clearly, I think the answer to that question, are they educating, is no. And that might seem odd, because when you think about it, let's look at the BESA figures, the British Educational Suppliers Association. We have over 20,806 primary schools. We have 4,190 secondary schools. We have 264,804 teachers in primary school, 247,378 teachers in secondary school, and over 9 million pupils attending school every day. So that's a lot of people doing something every day that we take as education. And we don't really think very much or very deeply about what actually is education, what is going on in the schools. We've heard about the egregious cases, and believe you me, I could give you a lot more examples from Don't Divide Us of the, not just the shocking examples of sackings and job losses, but the everyday cruelty that goes on, the everyday arbitrary meting out of the illogical injustices of what passes as social justice that are bound to leave any thinking adult or child befuddled and bemused as to what is actually going on. So we're not educating, and the statistics that I've given you show you a key problem, which is that education isn't fundamentally an empirical phenomenon, right? So you can have all the statistics you like, all the inquiries and official policies into, let's look at how many kids are too hungry to learn, too fat to learn, too stupid to learn, don't have good enough parents to learn, whose teachers, all the kind of litany of secondary things that have nothing to do with the fact of what is the quality of thinking, what is the knowledge that we are teaching, how is that knowledge being taught? Are we encouraging children to engage with our cultural legacy with an attitude of suspicion, inbuilt contempt, derision? Or are we encouraging them to go in with a more open mind, to confront ideas that they don't find every day at home? Because what would be the point of that? Why pay a profession? Why pay for schools if you're only going to give children what they can already find in their everyday lives? And that mantra of representation, we must see ourselves before we can learn, is the most Philistine, anti-intellectual, destructive idea, and it's taken a hold everywhere in education and beyond. So no, the statistics don't tell us anything. If we don't value thinking, if we don't value our past cultural and intellectual achievements and are prepared to give them their due of respect and critically engage with them, but you can't critically engage with something if you don't engage with it first, and that means understanding it and recognizing it, seeing where it sits in its own place, in its own time, and then judging comparatively how it fares with today's knowledge or today's mores. But if you don't do that, if you go in with a critical lens straight away, you destroy education. So we're not educating. We have many subjects today on the curriculum. Many people in favour of modernising 21st century skills will say, oh, it's so tedious, we have such an academic curriculum, all these traditional subjects that we've had for 80 or 100 years. That's rubbish. Because if you look at those subjects, the label might be the same, but the intellectual and imaginative content has been hollowed out. With this level of prevalent cultural hostility, which is unique to the American sphere, I would say. I don't think it's prevalent all over yet. I don't think we can educate. It's as simple as that. When we think of teachers as being a profession that has to be trained rather than educated, and here I kind of semi-agree and disagree with Debbie, I don't think you need critical thinking as an add-on. I think if you have knowledge and engage with knowledge and think, that is critique enough built into that. I've got to stop now. There you go.
Okay, well, that's four fantastic contributions to some of these questions. But I want to hear what you think. I mean, I'm really struck by things that people have said, but I've got disagreement points with everybody. But let's the hands are going up already, so let's get out there.
Yes, thank you. I used to be a teacher. I escaped. And I remember the before times, and I have to think of myself in the before times and the now times. The before times, I just thought things were normal. And then a few years ago, the scales fell from my eyes, and now I come to the battle of ideas. But before, I remember being a teacher and just thinking that there was broadly sort of good and evil, like a real Disneyfication of looking at the world. And I think a lot of teachers do. And I look back, and I kind of don't want to scrutinize too much, because I think, God, how much indoctrinating did I do? Thinking I was just talking about what was broadly good and not really seeing my own biases for what they were. And I think one of the challenges that we have is that a lot of teachers, you know, young, idealistic, are coming out of university thinking that there is good and there is evil, but there's a specific basket of good things, and it's not the Tories if you're coming through this sort of education training. And so I'm wondering if we're going to re-educate, or doesn't sound good, does it? Reach teachers, young teachers, people interested in the profession. How far down do we have to go to say it's not just good or evil? There's grey areas. There's, you know, complications. I worry that teachers coming through see everything in black and white, and with the best of intentions are indoctrinating children without knowing they're doing it. So what can we do about that?
Yes, I was just wondering where are the parents in all this, because I remember it's been a long time since we've had kids at school, but I know that if my kids were being forced to listen to this rubbish, I'd be in trouble. And I also want to know where are the kids too, because if I remember my lot, they were a fairly bolshy bunch. We've got 3 kids. They're all fairly bolshy at school, and they're still bolshy. Thank you. And they wouldn't take this stuff passively. They're questioning people as we taught them to be.
I had a very quick question, really. Have we sort of invited the wolf to the door in as many regards that schools are now having to do so much more parenting almost, and it sort of seems to be encouraged by the state to do so, but it seems a lot of times parents are either willing or happy for it to happen, and therefore they're leaving that gap to be filled by schools that never used to be and arguably shouldn't be.
I've just got a question for Emma and Alka. Could you comment, because your comment seems mostly focused on the work of activists, and I share your views of the danger of that, but could you please comment on the role of the Conservative Party in promoting indoctrination? Because it seems that we've got a situation where the Conservative Party is saying you should not be indoctrinating within schools, and yet it is itself promoting indoctrination through promoting British values, for example. So let's say, looking at it from the perspective of a left-wing teacher, why should I not teach critical race theory? Why should I not promote it if I'm also being told to promote British values? And we've also got things caused a lot of concern for Christian parents in particular, which is the new relationship, sex and health education curriculum. So I just wondered if you could comment on those two as examples of what appears to be the Conservative Party telling teachers to indoctrinate.
I'm now going to come back to the panel to respond, and we'll keep those comments nice and brief. We'll go back out and take another batch of questions. That last question was addressed to Emma and Alka, so Emma spoke first last time. Alka, do you want to respond to that or any other points that we've just heard?
I'll respond to that last point. I think what I'm talking about are the prior conditions that allow indoctrination to exist in the classroom. Those prior conditions have been created by both parties, everybody, and the coalition as well, and it's been going on since the 70s, We've had wave after wave of different forms of instrumentalisation. Now, of course, education will always have, like any social institution, will have secondary aims as well, to train a workforce, to create a literate population, etc. But there comes a point when, if that instrumentalisation reaches a certain level of influence and an intrinsic the evaluation and understanding of the intrinsic value of the thing is lost, then the thing itself is destroyed. And I think we're at that point, or getting very close to that point. I mean, on values itself, I think, there is a very good question put to myself and people who hold my position, which is, you claiming to be value neutral. How can you be value neutral? And the answer is, I'm not. I am not value neutral. I'm upholding truth and impartiality. There's nothing neutral about that, right? But the point is, it's not party political. Those are the values that are close, that are kind of, if you like, intrinsic to epistemology, to scholarship, and then further down the line to education. In a slightly different form, it's true, with children at schools, you're not talking about academic freedom in the sense it exists in universities, but that connection, the logical connection, has to be maintained. And if it is not maintained, if it is not affirmed, then we don't educate, then we indoctrinate.
Okay, so we've got, is it the Tories, is it the parents, is it socialisation? Should I share my own political views with the pupils or not? Lots of things on the table. Emma, how do you want to respond to that question in particular? What about the role of the Conservative government in all of this?
I think Alka said it perfectly, and I couldn't agree more, actually. I think that fundamentally it's not possible to be value neutral. Like I say, I agree with what Alka has said. And I think sometimes the issue is within schools that it seems that there isn't a recognition, actually, that those schools are being partisan. There is this belief that you are being value neutral in teaching these things that are highly contested ideas and highly contested political ideas. Just a quick point on British values. So the definition of British values was, I believe it was brought in under David Cameron in 2015. He gave a speech on that subject. And actually the reason why that was introduced into schools was actually to try and push back in some ways against indoctrination, because it was in response to the crisis that we were facing with respect to Islamist radicalisation and other forms of radicalism. And so actually it was an attempt to try and combat that. I don't necessarily think that defining British values is the best way to go about it, because it's very much like, as Alka was saying, it's similar to the critical thinking argument, that it's a shame that we actually felt that we had to do that in the first place. So no, I don't think it's possible to be value neutral, but I think that the values that schools ought to take, and this is the same with all sorts of institutions that have become politicised and have strayed from their purpose, is that you shouldn't be value neutral, but you should hold those values that are instrumental to you fulfilling the role that you are supposed to be fulfilling. And in the case of education, you have to be impartial. You have to recognise where you're being biased. And you have to promote honesty and truth and a certain set of values. And actually, going back to critical thinking, and also to the point that was made about the role of parents, character is extremely important. And if a child has a strong character, which is usually something that they can get from home, sometimes that's not possible because you can't choose who your parents are. And to some extent, that is always going to be a lottery. You can't do anything about that. And I think in schools, what we've seen is, and particularly pushed by activist groups, is this attempt to sever parental responsibility, to try and get around parents in some way, to try and almost in a Maoist way to bring children into this ideological movement. And I think that that's very dangerous. So rather than focusing on things like British values and critical thinking, I think schools should be focusing on trying to create the character, not just in their students, but also in their staff, that is that makes it more possible to facilitate learning, honesty, and the pursuit of truth.
Okay, thank you. Sean, I mean, feel free to respond to anything that we've heard, but I mean, you know, that idea of history being impartial. Can you ever teach history in a completely impartial, objective way? Is that possible? And hasn't there always been some element of indoctrination going on in teaching? Wasn't it ever thus?
Yes, it was. But in terms of my own subject, you can teach it in a balanced way. Whether that's impartial or not is I suppose, to be debated. But certainly you can sort of recognise that there are different, and indeed it should be, because it's the whole point of history. There are different interpretations, different ways of looking at it. But in terms of some of the questions that we had, how do you get teachers to recognise that there are grey areas rather than straightforward good, evil, good, bad, and so on? In my experience as a teacher, I think that you look upwards, and that will come from either the head, and particularly, actually, it's things like exam boards, that people will follow the least little sort of change of nuance, change of emphasis that comes down from the exam boards, because it's got that sort of power behind it, and there's a certain amount of fear, I think, that drives it. That and Ofsted, I suppose. And those are the bodies where I think it's important to really sort of re-educate, to use the term that you used, because they have a greater power than government over what actually happens in the classroom. I think parents are absolutely key. I think that's absolutely right. The great hope, I think, is that, and I would agree entirely with what you said about children, that there is a resistance among young people very often, particularly if they feel that they are being sold a line very obviously by a school. And I've seen that many, many times, both actually while they're at school and later when they're sort of looking back at that, there's a sort of recognition that that's what they're expected to say, and so they might sort of say it, but actually they sort of kick back at it later. So I think that is an area of hope. But very specifically on British values, the controversial bit about British values is calling them British. I mean, that was always one of the issues, because what is to say that they are specifically British? But when you look at what they are, they're things like, you know, what was listed as sort of free speech and voting and a fair justice system and so on and so forth, with none of which I would guess anyone would disagree. But what worries me about it is having it as a sort of separate strand in the curriculum, rather than making it core to the actual life of the school and the sort of philosophy of the school itself. That's where you should have the British values. And if you had that, you wouldn't need a sort of separate area of the curriculum. You wouldn't have to really react in a sort of knee-jerk way against Islamist terrorism or whatever. And now it seems to me that if the British values were actually instilled in the working documents and life of a school, we wouldn't even need to have this debate.
Thank you, Sean. So, Debbie, parents, you're a teacher, you're working in the classroom. How much of this do you think is the area for the parents to deal with, and it's not really something that you as a teacher should be engaged in? But then again, how much do you think of your job is teaching academic subjects, and how much is sort of socialisation, being in school, you know, working out how to be in society? You might want to respond to other points. I just wondered what you thought of that.
Well, I think when I became a teacher, I naively thought my job was to teach physics, but it is much more than that. I'd like to pick up on what my colleague, the former teacher, said about this good-evil dichotomy, and that is what's going on. There is a good and there is a bad. I think it comes sometimes from human nature. We are social beings. We are tribal in our nature, and we look for safety within a group, or many of us do. And shame is often used as a way of protecting us, and stepping out from the group is a very brave thing to do. I'd like to just pick up on what was said about what the kids think here, and the kids as well. They're human beings, and they're similar to adults in the way that stepping out of the group is quite a big thing for children. As for parenting, though, yes, we do more parenting than we used to 26 years ago when I started. And I think this is the part of the problem in society, that as a parent, I've got 3 children of my own, and my investment in those 3 people is lifelong. And I'm going to be a lot more careful about what I teach them. Whereas when it comes to when I'm teaching in schools, then I'm teaching those children for a year, so I don't have the long-term investment. Secondly, I've got a contract of employment here, which protects my livelihood. And if there's a policy to be followed, then it's hard to step outside from that policy if you think your contract of employment might be at risk. So I think what happens with the schools doing more of parenting, which is what we're doing, it's almost, again, it's that safety culture that people want to stay safe. And by staying safe, it means following the policy, which parents, I don't think, would do in the same way.
Okay, thank you. It's interesting to me how much we can trust the kids. Kids very good at spotting when someone's trying to sell them some ideology, but on the other hand, I think one of the trends we're seeing is that a lot of these opinions are coming from children. It's kind of adults that are seeking to accommodate those opinions rather than saying, like we might have done in a different age, no, that's nonsense, forget all about it. Anyway, let's go out again.
I would like to suggest that we should be focusing on critical education theorists and not just critical race theorists. I want to bring up a book by a guy called Isaac Gottsman, published in 2016, called The Critical Turn in Education, From Marxist Critique to Post-Structuralist Feminism to Critical Theories of Race, where it is detailed how the Marxist radicals of the 60s moved into the academy and started publishing, how they have radicalized the field of education, and this is something to celebrate, the field of education, by the way, being where educators are educated. Critical education theorists in the academy are running unethical experiments on young people and society. They know that's what they're doing, and they're using academic freedom and name-calling as a shield to hide behind so they can keep us arguing while they keep doing it. So my question, should we be tolerant of radical political activists, scholars trying to seize control of the field of education to reorient the direction of society?
Hello, even now I'm really nervous about saying what I feel and think. One of the reasons I'm here today is because I'm super worried about what's going on at the moment in my school in particular and certain London boroughs. The fact that activism is overtly promoted, that we're talking about children having critical thinking faculties or being agents with their own destinies, etc. But what happens when people are targeting the youngest? This is the reason I'm here today, because normally I'd just sit down, listen, go, yeah, that was great. This is not great. These are people coming into our schools and talking about the very youngest children and saying, you must start here. They're telling us things for which there is no evidence that if we follow their way, our results will go up. And we're kind of mute. We are muted. I took some comfort in thinking our silence at the end of three sessions where no new knowledge was taught, when no teachers were given any new skills. It was diabolical, nothing new. And at the end of it, no one had any questions, and there's a huge reason for that. It's because, weirdly, some of us felt that our silence was powerful, so I always speak. Oh, and in a borough where Naomi Fisher was allowed to stand up during a conference on rethinking education, where she said something like, when children are allowed to make decisions such as walking out of a classroom if they don't like what they're hearing, that's when everything's going right. It's undermining teachers, and teachers do actually think it's just that we're scared to say, especially in certain boroughs, we're really scared to say what we believe in, think, or question anything.
Thank you very much. That's it's clearly an authentic voice of someone who is worried about speaking out. Well, that's what the Battle of Ideas is all about. Free speech definitely allowed. Okay.
Ofsted hasn't been mentioned.
Good.
You mentioned Ofsted. So there's a really good campaign, positive Ofsted reform. Ofsted is taking British values, is taking tolerance, and saying you're not teaching this and this and this and this. Therefore, your review is coming from good to bad. And there's been a direct reviews to private schools, religious schools, and so on, and you can see Ofsted is not being held accountable by Parliament. So when people say conservatives or not conservatives, I also think of departments that are actually having more influence in actual curriculum.
Great.
And the third, just one question for the board.
Very quickly.
COVID has also led to a phenomenon of homeschooling. I would like to ask, what do the panel think about that potential solution that seems to be a lot of people are thinking about?
Okay, great, thank you. Homeschooling, is that a solution to the problem of indoctrination? We've already had the Conservative government we've had parents, now we're bringing Ofsted in. Whose responsibility really is this? So, what's your question?
I just wanted to ask, do we think that teacher authority has been hollowed out, which is why these competing ideologies have kind of been allowed to come in? And then how do we start to repair that? Because I share the lady's fears, and I would just like to ask, how do we start to repair and rebuild teacher authority?
Really good question. How do we start to repair teacher authority? That's great.
Question. I wondered what the panel thought of the current role being played by third-party providers in smuggling in critical social justice theories through the back door. It's certainly true in Brighton and Hove, where I live, and I had something to do with exposing the Racial Literacy 101 teacher training with the help of Don't Divide Us, which Emma mentioned, and that was very much the the work of a consultant that was known to Brighton and Hove City Council leaders, who was just appointed to do teacher training across every single school in the city, and is continuing to do that. It's working their way around every single school, started with the primary schools. So, question. What about the role of third-party providers? And I just wanted to say also on the issue of critical thinking, the very thing that is being fraudulently delivered into schools by these third-party providers is the idea that their critical social justice theories are indeed critical thinking. They are pretending fraudulently, and teachers are buying into this, that what they're doing is helping teachers to uncover the truth. Critical race theory is, of course, the truth. It is merely helping teachers to help pupils to understand that systemic racism is baked into everyday life. And so it's a kind of you've got to watch out for this thing, because in Brighton they keep saying no, it's nothing to see here. We are indeed just teaching critical thinking skills. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we've got this. This issue has come up several times in questions now about outside actors coming into school. It's not about the parents or Ofsted or whoever, the teachers. It's about outside actors. I wonder what the panel thinks about that. I'm just going to say we've had this idea of contested ideas coming up, but what about things like climate change and so on, which if you ask across society, is that a very contested idea? I don't know, but it seems to often fall into this basket of schools are indoctrinating around climate. So I wonder if that's something that any of the panelists might want to reflect on. I'm going to come back to the panel. I'm going to start with Debbie, and then we'll go to Sean after that, and then we'll go to Emma and Alka.
Yes, third-party providers are a problem. In my previous school, where I'd taught for 20 years, we were instructed to teach an RSE scheme, but the only schemes we had were coming in from third-party providers. And each one that came in, I was able to look at and able to critique and say, well, this fails on this point. This is not compliant with the law, etc., etc., etc. Now, on one hand, we're told to teach this stuff, but on the other hand, we're relying on third-party providers. In that school, we just didn't teach it, because every plan that came in, we felt was not suitable. I think the problem is that teachers can be aware that there's an issue. And when I was discussing with my colleagues in that school, my colleagues were aware there was an issue with this, but nobody had the language to call it out. And that's what I was saying about critical thinking. Teaching that course, I don't think it had much impact on the kids, but teaching that course gave me the language to be able to identify what the problem was here and to call it out. And once you've called it out, other colleagues look around and say, yeah, we can't do this, can we not? So I do think it comes back to teachers, teacher authority, and as teachers, we claim to be highly trained and highly educated professionals. And if that's the case, we need to be able to lead on this and use our thinking skills and have the language we need to call out this material, because it is dangerous, it is insidious, and it is harming our children.
Great, thank you. Sean.
I think the gentleman at the front raised the basic question which is underlying all of these, which is, do you tolerate radical ideas being put forward and the control seized by those who are promoting them? And it seems to me the answer is you should tolerate ideas, but not the control. And there's been a lot of talk about critical thinking, critical race thinking, critical education thinking, what have you. To me, I mean, it may just be because of the academic discipline I come from, it's really about evidence-based thinking. If the evidence is there and it supports the idea being put forward, then absolutely fine. But of course, what's being said is that a lot of the ideas being promoted don't have good evidence bases. And so essentially, it's only that. What is the evidence underneath the claims that you're making? And if there is no evidence, then the claim should collapse. But it won't collapse unless we address the issue that one or two others have raised, or I forget exactly who, which is about who is in control here. Because third-party providers are only able to get into the sort of into the system if they're allowed in by heads or local authorities or whoever is doing it. And that's why it seems to me the key figures are indeed head teachers, authorities, exam boards and Ofsted. And if Ofsted does need to be more accountable, then absolutely so be it. And that's something where it will have to be the building over the road that does it. But in the end, teacher authority is undermined from above or from those who have been allowed in by those above, and can only be strengthened with the support of those above. And that's where it seems to me those areas are key.
Thank you very much. Emma.
Oh, well, so many good questions. So I'm going to try and be as brief in addressing as many of them as possible. I want to begin, as you just did there, with the first question about tolerance, because I do think that that is the crux of it. And I agree that the ideas should be tolerated. And this is Karl Popper's tolerance paradox. It's actually the subject of my research. So please come back to me in a couple of years' time and I'll see if I have an answer. But it's Karl Popper's tolerance paradox. So yes, the ideas should be tolerated. But the problem is when those ideas themselves lead to censorship. And so that's the ultimate problem with radical ideologies. It was the same as the issue with Islamism, and that's why tolerance is probably defined in the British values. So to quickly come back to the point that you made about climate change, I think the issue with climate change actually may be that it is something that is contested, but it's something that hasn't been able to be contested by many people in many settings, because it is being. I tuned into the BBC for the first time because I'm staying in a hotel in a very long time, and just watching to do with David Attenborough's Frozen Planet and things like that. The coverage doesn't even acknowledge any other aspect to what is an ongoing discussion, even within the scientific community, on that subject.
What do you think of schools have? What part do you think schools have played in that, if any, Emma? Do you think schools are responsible for that kind of climate of conformity around that idea?
I imagine probably, but I'm not entirely sure because I don't have first-hand experience of it. But I think that probably the primary broadcasters have an awful lot to do with not actually giving an opportunity to any dissenters to actually air their views and to take those views seriously and to approach them with critical thinking, because people may be wrong, but if you want to be in a tolerant, open society, you actually have to allow everyone to air their views and to have those views able to be, people say sunlight is the best disinfectant. So I quickly want to come back to 2 points that were made at the back there about teachers and a teacher's authority, and the children walking out of class basically allowed to hold their teachers hostage. Because I think, as we were saying, that the parenting has been handed over to schools, but in many ways the teacher's authority has been completely undermined. And so what you've ended up with is, we talk often about, going back to climate change, the cult of the child and child-centred learning. This attitude that you often hear teachers saying things like, I learn more from the students than they learn from me. If that's the case, then something is very, very wrong. On homeschooling, I think, to be completely frank, if I had children now, I would be considering homeschooling them. And I don't think that is a perfect solution, because I think there are some things, such as the community aspect of schools, that can't be replaced. Schools are at the centre of communities. And anybody who experienced, being at school probably before the 2000s, maybe the 2010s, will recognise how significant that community aspect is. I don't think that can be replaced with homeschooling. I know some people are trying by forming homeschooling collectives, so it might be a temporary measure, but it's not going to be the ultimate one. On third-party providers, I think that is a really big issue because we basically opened up a market for these third-party providers to come in and to not be questioned. And when I did some research some years ago on Prevent within the curriculum and looked at some of the resources that were available to very busy teachers who go online and try to find whatever they can as quickly as they can, even then, and that was some years ago, they were, I would say, counterproductive resources if you were trying to create a sort of cohesive community. They were very much based on identity politics.
On that point, Don't Divide Us, I think, have done sort of work looking into the kind of resources that have been supplied, and so I don't know if you want to address that point, Alka, or anything else.
Thank you. Yes, I did. And I wanted to talk about the parent school division of Labour. On the third-party organisations, we've produced a report on the back of the Brighton and Hove campaign that Adrian mentioned. We identified at least 60, there are a lot more, providers over whom nobody has any oversight at all. These are providers that local councils are drawing on to draw up their policies for schools. Okay, we did not have the resources to contact every single school because schools since 1988 have local autonomy in these matters. So some may be drawing on them more than others. Some may be using them more critically than others. But the point is nobody knows. And this is what I meant at the beginning. We do not have anybody at a political level, at a professional level, at the level of the teaching unions, at the level of the exam boards, or even at Ofsted level, who is prepared to stand up and just say, we value education. This is what we understand by education. It is essentially a transmission of knowledge. That is, we understand there's a difference between knowledge claim, an opinion, and a belief. We expect our teachers to know the difference between this. And if they don't know the difference between these three different claims and the type of evidence that is needed to back each claim, then we need to ensure that they do know it, right? We need to look at teacher education.
But Alka,
So
I'm just going to press you on that point, Alka, because Debbie was saying, the solution to that perhaps is to teach things like critical thinking, to teach teachers and students how to think critically. But I got the impression that you weren't necessarily not so in favour of that idea. Is that
No, but simply because I don't think you can generically uncoupled from the substantive disciplinary knowledge. I find it hard to see how you have to be critical about something, right? So as an English teacher, for example, to just be critical about taking a critical approach to Shakespeare, for example, which is now kind of a dominant mainstream orthodoxy, like for teaching English, you're meant to teach it critically, without knowing about Shakespeare in his own terms, as a dramatist, as a person, etc. You need to know about the subject. But can I get back to what I wanted to say, please?
Yes, if it's possible. Yes, thank you.
I think also there's a way that proper thinking, is itself inherently critical, right? Because thinking is to question. It is to follow the implications further. It is to look for patterns and then test those patterns and then decide which conclusion you think is more credible. So it's kind of inbuilt, if you like. Anyway, what I was going to say is, we've got over 60 providers, all teaching sets of things. I wouldn't call it knowledge or curriculum. It's a set of beliefs and then mindless activities to promote these beliefs that are based on critical race theory. Britain is institutionally racist, and if you're white, you do have white privilege. And if you are black, you suffer racism, even if you don't see yourself as suffering racism. So this stuff is horrible. It's really vicious, and nobody has any oversight over it. Right? There's nobody calling these people out. What are their educational qualifications? Actually, some of them might have educational qualifications, but you look at them, they're not proper educational ones, right? They're like experts in educational technology, marketing, race, everything other than actual scholarly knowledge. Right? These are not the kind of people we should have in our schools teaching children. I'm sorry, but no, right? And in terms of So just quickly, very, very quickly, that does not mean I'm for banning all this, right? Because at higher education level in universities, yes, of course, every idea must be had out. But we need the freedom to debunk it and preferably refute those ideas. The problem is, as Emma said, is that this radical theory is now just extending outside of the seminar room into the practical and ethical practice of the institutions, and that's curtailing that freedom.
Okay, thank you very much. There seems to be an awful lot of agreement in the room, and I'm just anxious in case we have people in the room who feel that this is not an accurate depiction of the situation, and that some of the things we've been talking about should be in schools. If there is anybody in the audience that thinks that, I do hope you feel you can speak up. But on the other side, if there is this wide agreement, then why do we think we're in this situation? If this room represents society at large, so many people against the kind of things we're talking about, what do we do about it, and why is it taking place if there's such wide disagreement? Okay.
Hi, yeah, so my question was originally about curriculum, yeah, and it's now turned out that there's no one accountable for this, not even Ofsted, that's dealing with this, because if 20% of our kids are coming out at secondary school level illiterate, don't somebody have to worry about reading and writing and other bits before you start bringing in all this critical race theory and climate? And my second point, are we making a doom and gloom for our children? Everything's about something's going to die, something's going to end. What kind of society are we going to have? Suicides everywhere in 20 years' time? But I'm really seriously worried now by what you said. So nobody is accountable for this. I thought there must be somebody accountable to say, let's concentrate on this first before we bring in all this other stuff. You know, you're going to need to read and write before you leave school.
Brilliant questions. Thank you very much. Okay, sir.
Thank you. I was an elected official of the NEU, and I think my role, that my union have played an appalling role in all of this. I would say, I think what I'm worried about is that most teachers are not activists, but they are nice liberals who are frightened to say we are against diversity, equity and inclusion, which are the buzzwords. Now, they are Motte and Bailey terms of critical race theory that mean something entirely different. Equity is equality of outcome. Okay, diversity to me doesn't mean diversity of ideas, it means diversity of race, all who agree with critical race theory. And inclusion means turn up the sensitivity so that no one feels threatened in this space and object to any idea that you think you don't like. So there are a set of appalling ideas. Now, teachers unwittingly go along with this. My friend the other day posted something about, we've got a certificate for, inclusion, diversity and equity. I hear the head teacher at Harris Academy Crystal Palace is saying, we're going to decolonise the curriculum. They unwittingly take this on. Most teachers are not activists. Activists are about 1.5%, 2% of the union, but they're unwittingly taking it all on. We've got to help those teachers speak up, including the person at the back who mentioned that earlier, because we have to challenge these ideas are false ideas and they're Motte and Bailey terms.
I'd just like to very briefly look at what Sean said about who it is who's responsible in terms of Ofsted, head teachers, etc., etc. My point is you can't turn to them and expect them to sort this out because they instigated it, all of them. I think you would be hard-pressed to find a single teacher in this country standing up against this stuff. I hope Alka knows maybe a couple. It's so uniform, it's not questioned, which is why you get third parties walking through the door, promoting whatever silliness they want to, because they're allowed to, because it's expected. And then you also... Not just in education. This is not just a problem of education. Weirdly, if you look at business is littered with this. There is not a single mainstream business that isn't having the same educational instruction for their employees and managers about diversity training and all the rest of it that's not happening in schools. It's uniform.
So this is a problem of society that's occurring in school. Can I just ask you, if a head were to stand up and challenge these things.
You know I can't answer that. And then I was a head teacher. I am now retired. Read into that what you like. Right? The answer's there. You dare to do it, you are not going to stand up for very long. So I'm very, very sympathetic to your position. And so looking at teachers as if they're going to stand up and suddenly come out and say, no, we reject all of this, well, they're going to lose their jobs, aren't they? That's the truth, and that they will be targeted and picked off. Now, if we all decide to do it politically, that's different. And so in this room, we've got to decide, are we prepared to try and forge some consensus against this? And that's, I think, the way it works.
That's great, thank you. If there's any other... Thank you.
Hi, I'm sitting here and listen a lot of interesting opinions, and it gives me a lot of help. But what I'm thinking is, because I'm immigration, as an immigration teacher, I find there are lots of culture values. It's quite difficult to choose. So I'm thinking, since we sit here and discuss about these things, so I think it's more dangerous about how many values our teacher give to children unconsciously.
Unconsciously. Yes. Very interesting. That's a really good question. What about the unconscious transmission of values or not? Thank you.
Point on Sean's opening remark, if I may, if I misunderstood you. You said that the word indoctrination is challenging because it implies that there is an end goal. And it seems to me that there is one, that is the basically demolition of all the pillars of Western society. I mean, if you were consciously planning to destroy Western society, what would you start, if not the question, what is a woman? That seems to me that that's sort of the goal. But being a bit pessimistic about this, I wanted to ask the panel a question, and that is, I don't think we are going to be able to hold anyone accountable, at least for a long, long time. Not the Ofsted, not the Tories, not the Labour, not anyone. So, with that in mind, what do you see the near 10, 15 years, the students that are coming out, what would they look like, and what would they be thinking? Thank you.
Permit me to just play with a little can of worms for a moment, taking this in maybe a slightly different direction. Sean, you were saying a moment ago about the fact that basically we need a rational scientific approach to this. We have beliefs, and if the evidence doesn't stand up, then we need to dispense with them. That's, obviously a strong Enlightenment idea. But then, the Enlightenment ended and things moved on. Which is why I wanted to ask about faith schools, which also you mentioned in your opening remarks. As someone firmly on the fence, but I move in lots of different religious and spiritual circles, let's say, there seems to be a great diversity of viewpoints on this, from, that truly is indoctrination, to send your child to a school where the tenets of a single faith are being taught, and there's no scientific evidence to back it up. To, at the other end of the spectrum, these schools are one of the last places where vestiges of what you could call traditional values that we've been discussing can actually be found and are being taught, and that they can see how valuable that is for the children at these schools. So I'd love to hear 30 seconds from each of you on that point.
I haven't heard anyone talk about how schools are mandatory, or at least really close to mandatory for people. And recently, there has been a thing passed on that suggests that if you want to homeschool your kids, you have to register as a homeschooling thing. And this is the thing, there is no way out of this. This is what we need. We need to walk literally out of the classroom. We need to let our kids walk out of the classroom or out of the school. Your kids don't need school. They in schools they get schooled, like literally brainwashed to do whatever. And again, if the ideology captures that system, all you get is this: the introduction of the critical race theory and everything like that. And again, doesn't matter if you agree with the critical race theory, it can be captured by any kind of religious. It's not your values. You need to teach your kids. You need to take responsibility of your kids, and you need to change the laws that says schools should be mandatory.
the latest bit of legislation is suggesting that it's going to become more and more difficult to home educate your school. That's an important point. Okay, we're going to go back to the panel. Panel, you can't respond to all of that. I want you to respond to just 1 or 2 points so that we can get back out and grab some more comments. Alka, if you'd like to go first.
So I'll pick up on the question about what values we might be passing on unconsciously that I think the lady asked. I think as a teacher, if you have to have a commitment to impartiality, to teaching in an impartial way. And I want to just give a very concrete example. This is from a teacher that has been in contact with us. If, for example, you are and there's no reason why you wouldn't, if it's in the news and you're doing a kind of social studies type assembly or a PSHE lesson, and the tearing down of statues, Edward Colston, for example, has been in the news, you might want to discuss that with your class. You might want to have a lesson on that, okay? And that is fine. That is absolutely fine. But if in that lesson, all you talk about are, well, why do people want to take this statue down? If the only homework and work that is set are asking pupils to address that question, or perhaps think about who they might wish to replace Colston with, then I would argue that is closer to indoctrination than education. The reason why is because they have completely obliterated from the discussion any idea that there is a respectable opinion that does not want Colston to be taken down. It is assumed from the start that a whole swathe of opinion with which many people agree is illegitimate. And it's that unspoken assumption that is really at the crux of the way this indoctrination is working. It's much less through overt support BLM, although that does happen, but it's much more through assuming that certain viewpoints that are majority held are illegitimate, and that is the worry. One of those being, universal approaches to anti-racism, for example. It's like, oh, so old hat, so boring. Oh, you can't really believe in that anymore, can you? That's stigmatizing. That is not educating. So there's that on that.
Sorry, I'm going to have to move on. We've got about 7 minutes left to go. So, Sean, nice and quickly, thank you.
Answer to 2 points. In 10 years' time, well, I look at my own university, which is Anglia Ruskin in Cambridge, and of course we've got a Cambridge University nearby, and people often ask, do we get a lot of the sort of student activism at Anglia Ruskin compared with Cambridge? And the answer is no, because our students are absolutely focused on their work, on getting the degree, and it's led me to really to think that a lot of this activism is a child of middle-class privilege. Frankly, and that those who are really focused on the work don't have time for it. Doesn't mean they won't engage with ideas, but there's a different work ethic. And as for the faith schools point, it's an interesting one that set me thinking quickly. Faith schools provide an alternative set of principles, and I think their role is potentially much more interesting than people have realised. And if you say faith schools, then some people sort of cut off because they think, I'm not religious. That's not the point. It's the fact of having a different set of principles by which to on which to structure the education that goes on. That, I think, is a message which faith schools could actually, and the onus is on them, promote much more forcefully and perhaps with a bit more thought about how to do it. But I think there's an opportunity there which they could very well fulfil.
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, lots of people sending their children to faith schools kind of in spite of the indoctrination for the quality that faith schools, they believe, provide. Debbie?
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on the homeschooling. When children are at school, they are influenced. They're influenced by their teachers, who most of us are nice liberals, and their peers. If they're being homeschooled, who is influencing them then? What we do at school is we take their phones away from them for about 7 hours a day, and that's important. And it was during the 2 periods of lockdown when children were homeschooled for lengthy periods of time, this problem, in my view, exacerbated because children were being influenced not just by teachers or their peers, but by online influences on Reddit, on TikTok, on YouTube, on all the other social media platforms, and we had no control or knowledge of what they were being influenced with. And that's what worries me about taking children outside the social environment of a school.
Socialisation in school, very important, I think. Emma?
To build briefly on what Alka said, I think actually that in many ways, and it goes back to what we were saying before about this new guidance to do with transphobia in education, discussing women's rights, being balanced in teaching is actually now viewed as being in some way a phobia, transphobia or racism, to discuss what the other side may be. That's viewed as being somehow verboten. And I think going back to the point that was made about liberals, teachers just being nice liberals, I think actually sometimes because of the way that the language is actually quite confusing, that teachers can end up as being almost sort of woke adjacent. They are not themselves activists. And that goes down to what the point about the unconscious transmission, because it's not just unconscious transmission to the students, it's also unconscious transmission to the teachers themselves. And I think that has really thrown things out of kilter. What we should be doing is teaching, to go back to the first question, reading, writing and arithmetic. You teach properly and the teachers are educated properly, then all of the rest will follow. And I think that the issue fundamentally is that for not just for teachers but across the board, the threat to people's livelihoods is just far too high. And just to finish on this one final sort of comparison, this is not dissimilar from what we see in the police, that Mark Rowley putting the emphasis as an example, instead of on the policing, being on challenging all of these different isms within the police force. We need our institutions and our sectors to serve the function that they're supposed to do. So to go back to my original point, teach traditionally, teach properly, and all the rest will follow.
Great, thank you very much. Right, we've got just 2 minutes to take in the last points.
As a parent, I'm saying it's very difficult as a parent and as a worker in a big corporate. These ideas are everywhere and it's very, very difficult to speak up. You feel very alone. I wish there would be more, so don't divide us. It's given me a lot of support, just not feeling alone. But we don't all have the opportunity to homeschool and do it well. So I agree, homeschooling has a lot of screens involved. People have to go to work.
So I just really want to play devil's advocate to some extent, because actually I agree with most of what everybody said. But as a parent, I look at what this lady said, which is these ideas are out there. And the gentleman went, no, it's out there. And this gentleman said, yeah, it's the middle class ideas, that's where it is, which is true. As a parent, I want my child to leave school and get a nice middle class job. Do I just say, that's okay, do it because that school's teaching you what's out there and I want you to learn the language and everything.
That's great, thank you.
Suck it up and say, okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Is it what you need to know to get on in the world these days? Okay, panel, we have literally just a couple of minutes left, so 1 minute from each of you, please, in the order in which we originally started. So Emma, would you just give us 1 minute of your final thoughts, please?
On that final point, I think it's people's duty to resist this and to stand up against it. The reason why it's not okay to just simply say, well, they're learning the language of the situation that we're currently in, is because that is bowing down to what is essentially a form of authoritarian oppression. And that's just simply not acceptable. This is destructive. And if we want to live in a good, open society where people are free to discuss their ideas, then we have to ensure that it has to start in the family and it has to start in education.
Thank you very much, Emma. Sean. Just hold and we'll thank them in a minute. Sean.
Just always ask for the evidence, whether it's a parent, whether it's a teacher. People are giving you these ideas. What is the evidence? What is it based upon? And don't let them say such and such a book I read, but what was the evidence on that the book was based on? So always use that, and you can't go too far wrong.
Thank you very much, Sean. Debbie, critical thinking again by the sound of it. What do you think?
Yeah, the ideological capture has been deep and successful, and we'd be very foolish to think that we can overturn it in a minute. It will not be easily unwound, and for the starter, we need at least give people, teachers especially, but also children, the language to call it out.
Thank you very much. And final word will go to Alka.
Parents are citizens as well. Teachers are citizens as well. Okay, we have more than one role, so whatever you say to your child in private in terms of how to get on, that's fine. But you also have a duty as a citizen. and you can come to Don't Divide Us or any of the other groups around these issues where we do not have the answers, but you will meet like-minded people where you can rehearse the arguments, you can go through the arguments, you can find out what other people have said and get help in how to frame letters of questioning or objection to heads, or how to, for teachers, for their head to their line managers to raise objections. We have a head who is now rewriting a policy for schools on third-party providers. And bit by bit, at the end of the day, I quite agree with the gentleman who said you can't look to it. As long as we look to someone else, we're doomed. Right?
I'm going to stop you there.
We have to do it.
Because someone's looking at me telling me I'm doomed. So thank you very much.
All right, your courage and
come and talk to everybody afterwards. Thank you.